Hello folks, and welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to do a review of a kit that I was asked to build by Tony Ray of his 1/6 scale Tiger Moth. This is a laser cut balsa kit aimed at both IC and electric, and in the case of IC aimed at 4-stroke motors in the 52 to 70 range, and regarding electric he suggests motors in the 35 to 30 range running on 4S. In this video I'm going to look at the instructions that were provided, the design of the kit, the materials that were used and provided by Tony, and finally the modifications that I've incorporated and why I've done that, and how I think they'll improve both the scale appearance but also the practical application of this model on the flying field that I work from. So if you're interested in model making, you may be interested in this kit, get a favourite tipple in hand, strap in, and let's see what I think of this model. Let's begin with the instructions then. As I suppose it's common with many kits now, the instructions are online and they're not actually provided in the kit as a printed booklet, which is just as well, because I think the total number of pages on this would mean that you'd end up with something that looked like an old-fashioned telephone directory. Tony's approach, as you can see here, is to use photographs with minimal written instructions, which is fine. That I have noticed one or two omissions in the photographs that you end up with a kit part that you can't work out what it's for until after the event. That was the case with the dihedral angles, jigs, which aren't shown anywhere on the instructions, but when you're left with a couple of parts and the help from actually Cliff Harvey, I was able to find out where they were. So what you can also notice is that in my case, I actually printed off the checklist. Now the checklist, I think, is essential because part of the manufacturing process, to make the best use of the available balsa and other material that's used, the parts jump around a bit, so you don't have a sheet that's just wing parts or a sheet that's just fuselage parts. They're spread throughout the kit, and to find them you really need this part location lookup form. Without it, it would be like putting a jigsaw together, literally, but without a cover on a box to look at the pictures. So that's essential, and I would recommend that you do that. So I don't have a problem with that method. It works well. You're also provided with a set of plans. The plans are full scale for the wings and the tail surfaces. There you go there. Let's zoom out a little so you can see them. And they're very, very accurate. They're so accurate that when you put the parts together, there's literally no discrepancies at all, which when I've been working from plans in the past to scratch build from designs way back in the 1940s and 30s, that the physical process of drafting plans often leads to errors, and there aren't any in this that I can see. The plans regarding the fuselage are different because you don't build the fuselage on a plan. Instead, it simply locks together like a 3D jigsaw. If I turn it around, you can see it here. You don't really need to make much reference to this, to be quite honest with you, if you follow the instructions on the photographs. And interestingly, you can see that Tony's sketch includes the motor location. Anyway, more of that in a moment. This centre of gravity has become a bone of contention with Cliff Harvey and myself, and I'll have a little discussion about that later on. Anyway, instructions are really good with the proviso that you need to look at them very, very carefully. And actually, there was one issue I came across, and that was when I was building and looking at the wings. Obviously, it's a biplane. You have upper wings and lower wings, and the fixtures and fittings are slightly different depending on which set of wings you're building. And in the photographs, all the instructions are there, but they're not in order. So, for example, it jumps from one fitting to another from the upper and lower wing, which can be a little confusing. And it took me a couple of run-throughs to understand what I was looking at. It would be helpful, actually, if those photographs were separated into lower wing and upper wing. If that doesn't get done in the next sort of batch by Tony, I would suggest that any builders print off just those pages and put them into the correct order for their own sanity. Otherwise, you will find it difficult to jump around. Tony's also included some outlines for the identification of the aircraft, which you can use as stencils if you want to go down that route. So plans, fine, very accurately drawn. You don't really need a full-size plan for the fuselage, so that's fine. Photographs are very, very useful. Be careful though, there are one or two parts that aren't shown on the instructions. So let's turn our attention to the design itself. Well, if we look at the model, I think it looks very attractive indeed. And the first thing that strikes me is that Tony designs his models light. Obviously, light models fly better than heavy models, but there's a certain compromise needs to be made regarding making them robust enough to withstand the rough and tumble of RC flying. But generally, my first impression is that Tony builds a light model. I've actually beefed up one or two areas, but I'll talk more about those when it comes to the actual modifications that I've made. What is striking, and you'll notice them here, is the detail of the luggage rack or luggage door and the working doors on both the pilot's seat and the trainee in front. Now, are they necessary? Of course not. Could you omit them? Definitely. Could you make them so that they look the part but aren't functional? I think that's a real option. And personally, I think, well, I'm definitely going to glue this door shut once the covering's done. These will have to come off again for the covering process. I'm tempted to leave the doors open on the pilot side, because I have seen pilots, particularly when they're testing an aircraft and flying low, with the doors open, and that gives an opportunity to look at the interior. The cockpit detail is exquisite. It hasn't been added to the front compartment yet because I need to install the fuel tank, and I'll need to make that at least removable in terms of screwing it off probably. But the instrument panel itself is a work of art in my view, and really does make the model stand out. So that's a design feature which you can decide to approach differently, I would suggest, if you're looking for an easier route. The cabin is very scale-like. My first impression was, goodness me, this is going to be featherweight and very lightweight. But once it's all screwed together, and I haven't actually Loctited these yet, and there's no rigging that comes through here to the cabin which anchors it to the fuselage yet, but it's very robust. I'm very much surprised. So it looks cool, looks the part. Undercarriage, likewise, really does look the part, and it does look delicate as well. Only time will tell whether it stands up to the rigours of May landing, but it certainly looks like the undercarriage that you would find on a Tiger Moth. And it's functional in that there's a degree of springing in it, which will absorb some of the hit on those rough landings. Now, let's have a word about the laser cutting. The laser cutting is absolutely superb. I've never built a laser kit before. I've built some kits where the parts were simply printed on the balsa and you had to cut them out yourself. I've also worked with kits where the parts were die cut out, and that can be very good, as has been the case when I've built flare kits, and it can be atrocious where rather than cut the balsa, it looks like you're crushing the balsa. And of course I've built scratch built models where you have to do it all yourself, but this was something of a revelation to me. When it came to making the wings, I was able to put the wings together, dry run, as Tony suggests, for all of the construction, and then pick it up and it stayed together without any glue. So that is a testament, I think, to how close the tolerance of the laser cutting is. Let's have a word about the materials. You can see from this part of the instruction booklet that I've printed off that there are four main types of wood. We have pine, Paulownia, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a new wood to me, which is a hardwood, balsa and plywood. You also have steel, aluminium, some form of plastic for the cowl, more of that in a moment, and of course all the hardware that you need in terms of nuts and bolts to put the model together. Let's start by looking at the balsa. By and large, I think Tony's kit has a good selection of appropriate material for the job in hand. In terms of balsa, it's heavyweight, generally where it needs to be, and lightweight where it needs to be. My only criticism, and it's partly the wood and partly the design, is on these ribs. You'll notice I said that Tony builds light. He's included cutouts in all of the ribs, but the balsa itself is also fairly lightweight. And when I've put it together, and when it actually comes to rigging the model up, you tend to manhandle this part of the wing quite a lot. And I think it would be very easy to break through the ribs if you're clumsy like I am. I might do fine scale modelling, but I'm still a bit of a lump when it comes to handling things. Now I've got round that by facing the inner ribs on both the upper and the lower wing with 1/16 plywood. You don't have to do that. Another alternative would be, if I show you on here, these cutouts are lasered out, and a suggestion I would make is to leave them in situ and glue them in place for these inner ribs, and that will just make them a little bit more robust and able to handle clumsy fingers when it comes to putting this model together. So that's the only criticism regarding the wood itself. By and large, I think the selection is actually excellent, and the hardwood that's included is used in all the right places. So for example, here in the lower part of the fuselage where the wing bolts on is hardwood, and then it goes into plywood and balsa. One suggestion that I would make, and it's visible here, the cabins on the design are bolted into some captive nuts inside, but as designed they would crush up against the balsa skin, and to me that's not going to produce a very strong structure at all, because it's going to collapse it. And if you look closely, I've inlaid here a plywood part to alleviate that issue. So I'm screwing against a plywood insert rather than the soft balsa. I'm jumping ahead a little bit there. I'm talking obviously about some modifications, but we'll come back to the major ones in a moment. This is the cowl, which if you're going to build one of these kits, I doubt you'll face this issue, because I believe from information gleaned from Cliff Harvey, that this cowl has been replaced by a new material. This was is a plastic cowl which is brittle if you drop it or bang it or pull it about. It's deformable with heat, and that's useful because you can form it to the shape, to the bulge that's required here and the bulge that's required around the oil tank. So you apply heat and you can move it around. Of course, when it comes to flying a model with an IC engine in, heat's a bit of an issue. So what I did do was fiberglass the inside, and that's why you get a grey appearance to this, because I coloured the fiberglass resin, or painted over the top of it in an epoxy once it was done. So that needed strengthening. Somebody who saw a previous video said it was bulletproof. Let's hope we don't have to test it. But I think that may not be an issue that people would face in the future, because Tony's changed the design of the material. Let's have a look at some of the features here. The interior, as mentioned, is included in the kit. However, the seats aren't. Are they necessary? Well, of course not, because once the doors are shut, and if you get a figure in there, you're not going to see it anyway. I was asked to review it, and I've included them in the design. And now they're there, I think I'm going to have to make use of a full-size figure in this cockpit to get the best out of it. The materials, the actual sheet, aluminium is nice, it forms well, it's easy to manipulate. The trick is, if you're trying to curve it, you need to be on a soft surface that has some give in it. If you don't do that, you'll struggle to form it at all. But a rolling pin or any cylindrical object pushed into a soft cloth, in fact, I found the best thing was into a sandbag, and then it forms very, very easily. Right, in the next part, I'm going to talk about some of the modifications I've made. Some of them are for practical reasons, and some are purely for aesthetic reasons. So let's have a look at that part next. I've tilted the model forward so you can see it better, and you can see obviously something that I've already mentioned, and that's the plywood overlays on these ribs, just to make it more robust for handling. And you can also see that I've included here some gussets into this corner part, which I felt was a weakness in the design, because you only had small gluing joints holding everything together. So that's an example of a practical change that I made, which I think will make for a more robust model. One that I haven't done yet, which I will do, because you'll notice that this hasn't been sanded at all. That's my practice. I tend to leave the model unsanded until just before covering, because I find that in the workshop, in this case the dining area or wherever I'm stacking things, they tend to get bumped and knocked, and I try to leave the sanding and final finish until just before covering. But I will be putting a block in here, at least a partial block, to help the covering take the form rather than come down really sharply. The other major change that I've made is that, if you look at a previous video, I've incorporated a pull-pull system, or will incorporate a pull-pull system, of which you can see the crank for the rudder there. And that means that the cables will run around the outside and come to a scale location for the rudder horns. And likewise for the elevator, there's a horn above and a one below, and that too will have cables emerging from here on the fuselage. To me, they're so iconic to the appearance of a Tiger Moth, I had to include them, but it did make for a difficult installation. And you can see what I've had to do. I've had to mount the servos low down, mainly because I've put the seats in, and that's just the back plate that's fell off because it's not glued in yet. leaving all that until the covering. So the seats are in the way, and that means everything has to be lowered down. But I think I've worked around it, and if you want to see how I've done that, you need to go to the playlists and have a look at the closed loop installation, and you'll have a better idea of how I've done that. Overall, really pleased with it. A few modifications, as I've said, but I think they'll make for a better model. And that's not a fault on Tony's part, it's just my particular foibles and what I'm looking for. Next point, I'm going to have a word about how I'm going to finish this model. And we'll talk about its overall weight, what it weighs in at, and that will have an impact on how I cover it. Well, I've just weighed the model and it weighs in its current state, that's minus 2 small servos and a flight battery at 1.8 kilograms. Now obviously it's uncovered, but I think that gives you a hint to how light this model is built. Now, when it comes to covering, I'm torn between covering it in silk and a commercial fabric covering. I can't bear the thought of covering it in a foil, a plastic foil. I just don't think that does the model justice. I'd like to add wing stitching on the model to add to the look, and I think if I do that, I'm probably going to have to go down the covering it in Denby silk, which is quite laborious and quite involved, but I think this model deserves it. Or I take a shortcut and I go for a commercial covering and iron it on and get the thing in the air quickly. I'm undecided, so I'm not going to commit at this moment. That's why I'm doing this review video now, rather than when the model's totally finished and ready for a maiden. That'll come later on, I promise that. The other point is the CG. Now I've seen the CG in this location and actually way back here. Now I'm going to start perhaps with the CG round about there, because believe it or not, as it is now, that's exactly where it's come out as. And I think that might explain, if the undercarriage was in this position, why Cliff Harvey had a number of problems with it tipping over onto its nose, because the CG and the wheels are directly in line. Now I've moved this undercarriage forward about probably 3/16 of an inch. It's not a great deal, but I'm hoping it makes enough of a difference to make the model handleable on the ground and not have that tendency to nose over on takeoff and landings. That's somewhere down the line. I'm not going to worry about it now, but I'm aiming probably at the CG, maybe in the middle of there. Anyway, I hope you found that useful. Would I recommend this kit? Certainly. Is it a beginner's kit? Definitely not. Not because it's difficult or there are any major problems. There's just an awful lot of it. And if you don't incorporate some of the necessary modifications, I think you might end up with 1 or 2 problems. But that's a personal opinion. Tony Ray's built his as per prototype, and I've seen it flying on his videos and it looks great. You don't need to go to the extent that I've gone to regarding the cable pulling. You can use the included wire and tube and you'll get a very precise, accurate control of the surfaces. With the proviso that you take care with the sequencing of the photo instructions, and that you're aware that there are emissions. You take your time with this model. It's very, very buildable. And I think it's going to make a gorgeous addition to the hangar. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I hope it's given you the inspiration to get creative. Take care, folks.